Welcome to a brand new episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding, where we talk about Sri Lanka's past and how that has influenced our present and what we can do to inform our future. And I want to explore this conversation through the lens of women's histories, because I feel like we are an underrepresented voice when it comes to the Sri Lankan understanding, whilst being at the forefront of a lot of change that's happening in our country. We are here at this beautiful historical space of the Maitland Stateroom at the Mount Lavinia Hotel, and I am here today with my guest Widya Kumarasinghe, who is the co-founder of Every Story, an initiative. If you haven't heard of it already, you should. You can go onto social media and look them up. Every Story has been doing some pretty incredible work on capturing and documenting and telling the stories of Sri Lankan women, and particularly in the context of feminist stories, stories of resistance, stories of change, stories of achievement, from a different sort of perspective that we have been used to seeing in mainstream media. And that's why I wanted to talk about, when it comes to women's histories and capturing our stories, I thought Widya would be the perfect person to talk to, and how Every Story is doing that to make changes. Vidya is also in the work of public policy as a researcher and an advisor in certain instances in committees. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And so I'm going to just get straight into it, Vidya, to have an understanding of why Every Story even exists. What is it about the work? What inspired you to do this work in this country?
So I guess it started as most things do. We felt like there was a gap and it was something we wanted to take on. At the time, my co-founder Sharanya and I were doing a lot of work on violence against women, especially domestic violence and technology facilitated violence, and it was quite dark stuff, which also got us thinking about the root causes of that kind of violence. There's a lot of discussion at the time, some research that emerged around how gender norms and stereotypes are set at a very young age, before age 5. So that's long before kids even go to school, or a few years before kids go to school. And we wanted to try and see what we could do within that age group. So we decided we want to write children's books, and do so from in a Sri Lanka-based context, and as far as possible use real life women, because we wanted kids to see that women were sort of multifaceted, complex individuals, and I mean, one of the really interesting stories we got was a grandmother and her sister, so the great aunt, who were in Sri Lanka's very first cricket team, and who are of course now grandmothers. But for children to kind of be like, oh, this, my Archie is not just an Archie, like she also has all these other parts to herself. And we also want to explore consent, around respect, building a more pluralist society. And that's where we started. And as we were doing our story collection, we were invited to write a few profiles on Minette De Silva, Rajini Thiranagama, and Vivian Gunawardena. 3 women who a lot of people know quite a bit about, but we actually really struggle to find material. And it's not because it's not there, it's just that I think it kind of gets lost. People do write reports, there's lots of writing and research, but we felt there needed to be a more kind of cohesive archive of it. And most importantly, now some of those stories weren't necessarily told from the perspective of the actual person. It was always a third person narrative. So that's where stories of Sri Lankan women came in. And we started with documenting 30 stories, and our criteria is women who have significantly shaped Sri Lanka. We do storytelling in a kind of wider lens now, which I would love to talk about later, but that's really where it started.
And I mean, super example of the cool grandmother who is just more than just the grandmother. But can you tell me a little bit about, do you have anecdotes for some stories that may have surprised you, or some stories that have not been heard enough of, women who have not been recognized as much as they should have for the contributions they have made?
So we have a list of about 500 women, of which we've done about nearly 100 now. And in the first 30, we were also trying to meet to make sure that it was as diverse as possible. And almost accidentally, a colleague of ours told us about Mrs. Sita Jebanesan, who is a Western music teacher who still lives in Jaffna and taught Western music throughout the war. And it was an extraordinary story because this woman, this lady felt it was so important to keep teaching children music. And there's a line in the story about how she felt like she didn't want to deny children that privilege of listening to music and playing music. When the roads first opened up, there's a whole group of children who sat their Western music exams. And this sounds like a kind of, I guess, an everyday story, but to us it was extraordinary. Because when we say those who have significantly shaped Sri Lanka, that criteria kind of just kept expanding for us, because it was never about people who have reached the pinnacle of their career. Because there's loads of women who do extraordinary work who may not necessarily get that recognition. And for us it was also about the trajectory of that life, because it's all the context that I think helps with representation. So this story was, I mean, we have extraordinary stories, but I think it kind of shifted our criteria and opened up our mind to do wider work.
Why do you think, I'm curious to know, you use the word extraordinary stories, and it feels extraordinary because these stories are not told historically. They are extraordinary and yet they've never been captured, or they've never been documented, or never been mainstreamed. Historically, why do you think it is that, or how, if there's a comment you can make on whether you feel like women's stories have been silenced or sidelined to a certain extent, that there is such a gap there?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's patriarchy. It's a one-word answer. And no, I do think it's genuinely patriarchal norms. And in Sri Lanka, if you look at Sri Lanka's history, it is the stories of men who are often Sinhalese also. I mean, you do get occasionally other religions and ethnicities represented, but it is very much a class, race and gender-based dominant history. And that's just reflective of society. And it's the same all over the world, because we aren't unique in doing this work. We know so many feminist organizations and historians who are now looking at women's history.
Is it that historically storytellers have been men and that's why they tell the stories of men?
Yeah, I mean, there's that quote about, the winners of the war end up recording history. It might be that. It could also be that we're not, the kind of places where women's history is recorded isn't around us in the most obvious ways. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting conversation that I want to keep continuing and know more about. But we'll be back after this short break. Welcome back to this episode where we're talking about storytelling, and especially telling women's stories in Sri Lanka. Vidya, you said that you have, these 500 profiles that you're sort of exploring and doing the storytelling for, and you've been sort of traversing the island, different communities and all that. Have you faced any challenges in gaining access to women's voices, especially when it comes to different women and not people who are already, immediately accessible and in the public eye?
I guess externally it's mostly cost, because building these stories, even if it's in Colombo or closer to us, we have a commitment to paying everyone we work with, and it's a very robust process. There's a lot of documentation, making sure there's a lot of consent, and so it does cost money, which has been a challenge. And then subconsciously there is the propensity to record things that are a bit closer to us and maybe easier to do. But that is something we're working on. I think the challenge more was internally, because all of us were kind of hyper aware of what it means that we aren't kind of going as people from Colombo. Most of our team is from Colombo, but also from other parts of the country, that we don't kind of go in and record someone's stories and then come out. The writers are always from the community itself, so from the region itself. And then they of course have to be trained in the methodology. We never use translators or interpreters. The interview is done in the language that the storyteller is most comfortable in, and often written first in that language as well. So in terms of challenges, I think almost all of it was challenges we raised for ourselves, because we said, no, this can't be the norm. Okay. We have to do better than this, and this is how we want to do it.
And am I right to assume that there might be certain cultural barriers in accessing certain women's voices, where, like you said, sometimes society might not be comfortable with them telling their stories or sort of advocating for themselves? When it comes to the intersectionality of the women, how do you overcome things like the gender barriers, or it could be caste or religion, or how do you then represent those stories in a sensitive and appropriate way also, that there is sort of after their stories out there, that the women themselves, and some of those stories can be difficult stories to tell, that they have to then deal with the aftermath of it. How does that work?
So when we collect the stories, we have a feminist methodology, a story
Tell
collection.
me a little bit more about feminist methodology. Methodology, that's the word.
So it was created when we were commissioned to do this work called Stories of Girls' Resistance. It's a global campaign and project, and we were asked to do the South Asia version of the stories. So we have a story from every single country in South Asia. And actually our region is the only one that has a story from every country. And it was about girls who had resisted in their different ways. And with that came this kind of methodology, which we then adapted for Stories of Sri Lankan Women. So these things kind of happened at the same time. I think at the heart of the methodology is really consent. And it's about honoring the voices of those who are trusting us with their stories. So there's of course very kind of strong documentation. The consent document has a line for everything, so your audio recording, your transcript, whatever photos or notes you give. There's room for someone to share a part of their story, but for that not to be recorded or removed from the recording, and it's ongoing. So it's at any point for the rest of their life, if they feel like they want to withdraw the story or parts of their story, they can. Which I think it builds a lot of trust, and at the same time, a lot of those who collect the stories are often researchers themselves or trained writers, and they're, I think, very mindful of what is actually put down or how something is recorded. So beyond Stories of Sri Lankan Women, we've done some more recent work on abortion, safe abortion advocacy, and also on Sri Lankan sports women to mark the Olympics. And when we shot, so that was a new thing for us doing videos, when we shot those videos, we had to be sort of mindful that we weren't doing these, what they call the male gaze. And it's I think subconscious, because sometimes you take shots that you think look really cool and you've seen are really great, but are unconsciously perpetuating certain gender stereotypes and norms. After we took the videos and looked at it, there were also certain things where we felt maybe putting this shot of a young girl, maybe something that they're wearing, not that we believe in it, but because society perceives women in a certain way, that it was maybe responsible for us to just put it out there just because it was recorded and just because there was consent. So there's a lot of kind of work that goes into and I think we take a lot of responsibility. When stories are told to us, there's a lot of trust. It's so lovely because we've interviewed so many women some of who are the most interviewed women in Sri Lanka, who've said they've never had an interview like that. Because it is quite different.
That respectful space.
Yes. And the questions we ask, which is often a reflection of the journey, rather than just necessarily the outcome. So we have relationships with these people. And so there's a responsibility to honor those stories as well.
And have there been challenges from, say, families and like their general societies and communities when you want to?
Not really. Okay. There have been situations, we've actually recorded a few, and then where the story was completely withdrawn, just because they felt uncomfortable, and that's completely fine. And sometimes there is pressure from a family member who thinks that it should be done a certain way. And it has been tricky because we need to kind of respect the family dynamic, but we also want to respect the voice of the person who's sharing that story. So there's lots of stories where we parked aside and thought that we could go back to it at some point. But there's also lots of stories we record and then withdraw completely. And we have to respect that.
Thank you. So documenting women's stories in a feminist and respectful way, following feminist methodology. When we capture these stories, that was a new learning to me at a recent event that I attended that Every Story hosted, which I felt was very interesting, and we should talk about this more. And coming up next, after this short break, I'd like to talk about how these stories can create tangible and sustainable change when it comes to Sri Lankan policy. Welcome back to this episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding. Vidya, you in the previous segment, you talked about how you are doing certain stories for abortion rights advocacy. And then you also mentioned that you have been capturing stories of gender-based violence and like difficult stories to tell. Also stories that need to be shared, like lived experiences that need to be sort of heard and platformed in order to shape policy. So can you tell me a little bit about the importance of storytelling when it comes to activism, and how can storytelling be used in a way that is actually impactful and effective, and not just, you know, some sensational thing that everybody viralizes and then that's where it ends? Yeah.
So we call ourselves a storytelling and knowledge sharing collective, and that storytelling has been a core part of our advocacy. Unfortunately, now everyone is doing storytelling. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, but I think that storytelling has to be done in a very responsible way, and I'm not sure everyone does that. Storytelling for activism, we've been documenting some real life situations and representing them through animations, sometimes videos. Where the reason we do that is because we feel stories are better able to connect with an audience. There's an emotional connection, it builds empathy, we can build in a lot of details that you otherwise can't when you actually write something out. So we don't have to spell everything out. There's a lot of details we can bring in. The most recent work we've done came from, the commissioned work came because they felt that there's a lot of research and there's a lot of data, but nobody was reading and nobody was responding to the data in the way that we'd liked. So a lot of organizations are moving towards storytelling, which is wonderful. And I really do think, I mean, at the heart of our work is storytelling for advocacy, because we really do believe that it is much more impactful sometimes. I mean, Sharan and I both write for a living. We do all this policy analysis and research. But I think people connect with stories a lot more than that kind of data-driven approach.
And you did talk to me about sort of the consent and the respectful way in which you conduct the interviews, but how do you navigate this sensitivity when somebody is sharing a story that might be connected to a trauma, an intimate incident, you know, where again who you are interviewing for this, whose stories you're telling, they are aware that this is going to become a part of a report or going to a body of people who, you know, policymakers or wherever it is. How do you navigate that where you ethically sort of prevent re-traumatizing them, for instance, by having to tell their stories again, or something that they prefer not talking about? How does that work when that story is so important for the policy?
I think again it goes back to respect, and so when we do interviews, the people who have done, the interviewees are involved throughout the process. So the kind of light example of stories of Sri Lankan women, we don't do photographs, we do an illustration, and the interviewee is heavily involved in that process. It'll be like, oh, I like this, I don't like this, because you have a right to control how you're portrayed as well, right? I mean, other people put all kinds of photos of you, but if you can control this one thing. When it comes to more sensitive stories, the same applies. The person is consulted throughout the process. There is a lot of kind of going back and forth, because the writer is often also the producer. It's a very small team, so we're able to kind of maintain that communication. I think we're also very sensitive, and a few of us are kind of trained in doing this very sensitive work. So we have resources on hand to avoid re-traumatization. We take a lot of responsibility to not publish stuff, just even if it's extremely useful for the piece of work. It's what's more important is actually the storytellers, what they want out of it.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to put you on the spot with one question that you may not have expected about Sri Lankan women, because you're in this process of telling Sri Lankan women's stories. What is surprising to the rest of the public, like that maybe you are capturing and nobody has really looked at Sri Lankan women in that way? Is there anything that you can comment on? You don't have to, but what would you say is a surprising theme that could come out about telling Sri Lankan women's stories?
I don't know if it's unique to Sri Lankan women. Actually,
okay, women's stories in general then.
Women's stories in general.
Because why that question just came up to me was, recently I attended an event of yours, not the last one before, where you were showcasing a film and doing a conversation about resistance in the home through the act of cooking, which is something I'd never even considered. You know, stuff like that. I found like, wow, who knew? You know, if you can speak a little bit more to that.
So this resistance theme has kind of run through a lot of our work, and I think resistance happens in big and small ways. So even with the stories of girls' resistance, it was sometimes like everyday practices of resistance. It's a question that we asked in the stories of Sri Lankan women interviews as well, in asking them how they feel they resisted social norms in some way. And for many of them, it was just turning up and being themselves, like insisting that you went and did this degree, insisting that you were able to access this particular space. And so that has come throughout, and it comes in big and small ways. And I think we see that in our mothers, in our aunts, our friends, that kind of resilience and constantly turning up. I think that has been very inspiring. And yes, on the cooking, so we think of resistance as there's also people who have gone above and beyond and very publicly resisted, but there's also the everyday kinds of resistance that, like, women are exercising resistance in ways that we may not necessarily see.
Okay, and one last question before we wrap up, Widya. What do you hope, how do you wish to inspire the next generation of Sri Lankan young women, and maybe not only just in Sri Lanka, but young people, young girls here and anywhere else, on sort of looking at your body of work? What do you expect it to do for them, and how would you like them to take it forward?
Complex question. with the stories and also the knowledge sharing, what we really want to do is inspire dialogue and critical thinking. So we're trying really hard not to say this is how it is, this is a problem, these are the issues. We're trying to get people to think for themselves. And stories are very good at doing that because you carry something with you and you reflect on it without the demands of having to read something and then kind of break something down. So I really hope where our work does that and offers young people that space to reflect and think for themselves. A lot of our work is aimed at the general public. We do, of course, I mean, with our knowledge sharing work, we do prioritize girls and young women who don't always have the same opportunities. But we really do mean it's public facing because we think everyone needs to change. And when it's the next generation, I think I can go back to the story of Jayanti Kurutumpala, who's again one of the first stories we recorded. And her story is so I can see how kids respond to that story. And especially little girls who are able to see themselves in Jayanti. And with all of these stories, that's also what we're hoping to do. So all of the illustrations are of like our complexions, like Sri Lankan colors. They're wearing clothes that look Sri Lankan. And so we're kind of going right back to the starting point of every story, which is hoping that children see themselves in these characters, and not necessarily as role models, but I think that visibility really helps you expand your horizons.
Thank you for that. And I hope this inspired you to go forth and start telling stories more, especially capturing women's stories, because there's so much to tell. We are such layered, complex, colorful creatures, and I don't think we should ever be represented in a homogeneous way. Each of us has a story to tell, and that story can inspire millions, and that's what every story is doing, trying to capture a lot of those. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for joining us and hearing us out on this episode. We'll see you next time.